Hello and welcome back. This week's episode, we're going to be taking a look into part two of the Early River Valley Civilization series. I am Coach Bowman, and again, thank you for tuning in. And hopefully, you have been able to print off the notes and everything's going well. And here we go. We call the Early River Valley Civilization systems the cradles of civilization. As you can see, we talk about a cradle. You see the image there. At least for me, I think of an infant, my two boys who are now 8, and the oldest is getting ready to be 11. But when we look at a cradle and we think of infants, we think of young, think of new. And so these early River Valley systems were the new in the beginning of civilization, were the new ideas. These new ideas would have major contributions in the fields of social aspects, political, and economic progress. And that's going to be the core of what we look at today in this presentation. So when we look at the social aspect of these patterns that were developed by the early River Valley civilizations, we need to look at, first of all, how we see the rulers. Um, the idea of hereditary rulers, which means that the power was passed down. You inherit the power, just like we have inherited certain traits from our parents and grandparents. Likewise, the rulers would inherit their ability to have power, to have authority over people. And sometimes these families would last in control for a very long time, forming what we call a dynasty. And again, hereditary rulers were and powers passed down, and usually historical documentation indicates that it was from father to son. I always tend to get questions, well, what if they don't have sons? And then it would be whoever is the next male in the line of that person's family. So, for instance, if I didn't have two sons, I had two daughters, and I was ruling, then the crown would then pass over to my brother, who would be the next male in line. So we also have this idea of the dynasties, as I mentioned already, where power and authority stays within a single family. Um, we will be discussing dynasties later on in our next unit, SOL 4. And there are some dynasties that last for 50 years. There's some that we'll be talking about that last for over 500 years. So it's very fascinating how these families do stay in power and in control. Another development that happens during this time period is the creation of a position, especially in Egypt, known as a pharaoh. Pharaohs were seen as a god king here on earth. And this is what we would call a theocratic or theocracy style of government, which is when you combine religion with government. It's kind of, and I hate to use this idea of a fear tactic, but if you're going to upset the Pharaoh, if he is seen as a godlike figure, there are certain ramifications that will come from that. So, again, it's one of those things where the idea of organized religion and government combining together to form this new concept of a theocratic or theocracy style of government. Other social patterns that developed during this time period, we see a rigid class system develop. To me, when we think of, or when I think of a rigid class system, to me, it's a society where you can distinctly tell the difference between the social classes amongst the people. Some ways that societies have shown this is through haircut styles, certain types of clothing, certain types of building materials for one's home. Tattooing is another type of way that you can tell a difference between the classes as well. So this becomes a huge aspect. Also, it all will indicate wealth. It will indicate where you stand in society as far as a jobs go as well. And we also see the development of slavery during this time period. Slavery in the ancient world was very different than what we learned about slavery in our Virginia history classes. Um, it was not based on race. The ancient style of slavery was based on whether or not you owed someone money, or perhaps you were captured in battle. And so then you were forced to work for someone to pay that off or to earn your freedom. So that's going to be kind of the underlying theme with slavery for our class this year, that it was not based on race. An example of a product that was built by slavery, as you see there on the left, the ancient pyramids of Giza in Egypt. When we talk about political patterns, we're talking about the creation of government, or not necessarily governments, I'm sorry, but countries, things of that nature, states, what we would call even going smaller counties. In world history, we would call these early first type of states was a city state. In this case, the city controls the area around that city. So, for instance, the city of Richmond could control Hanover, Henrico, um, Chesterfield, and likewise, if you think even on a smaller scale, how Amelia Courthouse, which is where you would see or have the sheriff's office, the courthouse itself, kind of controls the county of Amelia in that sense. Multiple city states that are ruled by one individual is known as a kingdom. Kingdoms obviously are ruled by a king. If you controlled multiple kingdoms, you formed an empire. And Sargon the First of Akkad was the first to do that in Mesopotamia. If you've ever seen the movie Scorpion King, starring The Rock, and he is from the city of Akkad. So there's a little bit of pop culture in world history there for you. When we talk about centralized government, we're talking about a organized system with laws um, and protocols that people would have to follow. And for the most part, and especially in the early River Valley systems, this was a theocratic style. I know I've already mentioned that with the Pharaoh of Egypt, but other areas in the Fertile Crescent would kind of follow suit. So again, when you have either a priest king or a god king type figure controlling it, it is known as a theocracy. Another aspect that comes around during this time period, especially in the political aspect, are written law codes. We focus on two major law codes during this time period. It's the Ten Commandments and then the Code of Hammurabi. Some people might call it Hammurabi's Code. Very quickly, Ten Commandments were created by the Hebrew people, also known as the Jews. This was a moral code. If you recall the Ten Commandments, these are things that you should or should not do, which to me indicates a power of choice or individual will. All right. One should not tell lies. One should honor your parents. So it's one of those things that it's not saying don't, but it's saying you should. And within the Ten Commandments, there is truly no written punishment. So that is something that makes that tend to stand out. I know if you are looking at this from a biblical perspective, yes, You break the Ten Commandments, these are sins. And so, from that aspect, there are spiritual punishments. But as far as a physical punishment, the Ten Commandments do not have one in writing, put it that way. As far as the Code of Hammurabi, Hammurabi was a king of Babylon in Mesopotamia, and this set of laws was carved into a very tall pillar, as you see there on the left. These laws have harsh, strict punishments. This is where we get the phrase eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. So um, each law had a written um, each law had a written punishment depending upon what what the crime was. It also indicated the who you were in society. So if you were of a lower class and you committed a crime, your punishment was harsher than someone of a middle or upper class. So it is very focused on your social class as far as what your punishments would be. Looking into the economics patterns during this time period, when we talk about economics, I know a lot of people think money, but when we look at economics, you also need to think trade. You also need to think of goods and services. So one of the big breakthroughs for the economic patterns during this time period were the creation of metal tools and weapons. Um, Weapons tend to be an easy go-to. Students tend to think of that one right away. Metal tools, not so much. But when we look at these items, there are certain things that will come about. We'll start looking and finding tools and weapons made of bronze, which is a combination of tin and copper. Um, Tools and weapons that are made of tin was okay. If they were made of copper, they were okay. But you combine the two elements to make bronze, it was a stronger tool and a stronger weapon. So if you had a bronze axe, you wouldn't have to sharpen it as much compared to a tin or copper uh, axe. If you're into that type of business with the logging industry, if you will. Eventually, you have a group of people known as the Hittites. The Hittites are from a region in Anatolia. Today, we would call Anatolia modern day Turkey. This is where you would find the city of Catalhoyuk. We saw that in our previous um, unit, in our prehistory unit. But it was the Hittites who started to use iron and create iron tools and weapons. Iron's a whole lot stronger than bronze. So if you can think about that, the Hittites can, I guess, in some sense, become your first arms dealer. Here's a better way of getting that advantage on the battlefield by having those stronger weapons. From an economic perspective or a tools perspective, your tools can cut deeper, smoother, quicker, and in turn be able to produce more product. So those items will help to increase the surplus. A surplus is when you have more than enough of something. So when we look at agricultural surplus, we're talking about harvesting a wheat or corn, or if you're into livestock, having enough chickens or pigs or cattle to make a surplus. And then what would you do with that surplus? Or what would, I should say, what would cause that surplus? Better tools. You would have things like the plow and irrigation when we're talking about, especially farming. Being able to have a stronger plow allows you to go deeper into the soil to get those rich nutrients that those seeds need to grow. Other economic patterns that develop, the Phoenicians start to develop sea trade, as well as trade along the rivers. Um, I guess you can say they're the first Amazon Prime. So if you needed something, you would reach out to the Phoenician people and they would bring it to you. Um, Again, slavery, it was one of those things that took multiple forms, and you would see it being used throughout the ancient world. So, as far as religious traditions, things that developed during this time period, um, religion, and we kind of indicated this a little bit today in this PowerPoint, is a huge part of everyday life in these early River Valley systems. The center of government, as you saw earlier, could possibly have a priest king or god king. You would have, if you think about the layout of your city or your city state, you would probably have some type of religious building in the middle. If you think about how um, courthouses look, it's kind of hard to tell sometimes in your traditional older towns the difference between a courthouse and a church. So it's kind of interesting that here we are, uh, 2,000 plus years after these civilizations began, and you still kind of have some resemblance of those. Most of your civilizations believed in multiple gods and goddesses. These would be focused in on nature type elements, sky, wind, water, earth type of elements. And this is known as polytheism. So if it is if you're polytheistic, you believe in multiple gods and goddesses. The opposite of polytheism is monotheism. And there was one group of individuals that believed in only one God, and that was the Hebrews during this time period. Um, the Hebrews would later on create what is known as Judaism, and that was the first major monotheistic religion. We'll get into more details of the Hebrews next week. Um, but as far as what we need to look at this week is just knowing that they were the ones to create this idea concept of worshiping only one God, that one God controls everything. So let's take a look at some of these religious structures that have been left behind over time. So you have here what's called a ziggurat. Um, this is a type of temple. You can find it throughout the Fertile Crescent. The kind of the way I look at and how to remember the name ziggurat is if you look at the structure, there are very straight lines, kind of zigzags. If you look at some of those lines, they tend to zigzag with one another. So the idea of a ziggurat is a temple. Keep that in mind because then you have the pyramids that students kind of get confused, thinking it's a place of worship, but the pyramids were not. The pyramids were a tomb for the dead in Egypt. Now, the issue that a lot of people, some students are like, well, why aren't there more pyramids in Egypt? Well, that's because these pyramids cost a lot of money to build. When a pharaoh started to become, when he became a ruler at a very young age, he already began the plans for his pyramid. These ancient pyramids would hold him and his family after they are mummified and buried. One of the last major developments during this time period is the development of language and writing. Obviously, it is still a thing, and we're still using this ancient development. It is a huge cultural breakthrough. It will allow us to communicate with one another. It allows us to keep track of our own history, of who we are, where we have been. um, it helps with entertainment as well. So a lot of interesting things. If you think about, well, I don't like to write. I don't like doing those things. Well, if we didn't have writing, think about all the things that we would not have. And just the list will just go on forever. So, writing is huge. Um, Now, not everybody could. So, what's going to happen here is you're going to have the development of a specific type of job known as a scribe. A scribe would be someone that had a close relationship with the king or emperor, and would write down decisions, laws, things of that nature. So the scribe had to be someone who was, number one, educated, and number two, well trusted by the ruler. So the scribe is a very important position in the ancient world. One of the first types of writing that we have discovered, that has been discovered, is what's called pictograms. Again, very basic, very simple style of writing. Um, it actually doesn't even look like writing; it just looks like someone drew a bunch of pictures. So think about if you have a niece or nephew, or a little brother or little sister who's in kindergarten, and they start to draw. That's kind of what pictograms look like. Then you have the development of hieroglyphics, specifically in Egypt. These are the famous ones that you would see on the tombs in the pyramids, on the sarcophagus of the dead. And again, these are symbols or images. Sometimes they would use what's called papyrus, which was a reed that grew along the Nile River, and they would slice it and weave it together to make kind of like a thicker paper. If you kind of between notebook paper and construction paper, that is kind of what papyrus was. But the problem with papyrus is that once it truly dries, it tends to crack. It doesn't keep very long. So the carving hieroglyphs into the walls uh, lasts a whole lot longer than a scroll of papyrus would. Cuneiform was developed in Sumer, Mesopotamia, the Fertile Crescent region, basically. This style of writing is characterized as a wedge shaped style, usually found in clay tablets. You truly haven't discovered a whole lot of other materials, but cuneiform is known for its the way it looks, which I'll show you here in a few slides from now. And you also see the alphabet. Now, you might think to yourself, alphabet, that's something that we use, which it is true. It is. It is something that we use. But the alphabet comes from, it was developed by the Phoenicians. And I do apologize for my little toolbar there being in the way. But it's developed by the Phoenicians. Remember, the Phoenicians were the group of people that did a lot of sea trade and sea travel. So keep that in mind when we look at the alphabet and what the purpose of the Phoenician alphabet was. Again, the Phoenician alphabet will become what we will later on use as well. And you'll see that in the diagram here in a few slides. I apologize. My son is uh, doing his homework too. So enjoy that little brief cameo by Wyatt. But anyway, pictograms, as you can see there, very basic sketches into stone or clay. Again, this is the earliest form of writing. Again, very simple, very basic, very rudimentary style. We have found pictographs. Some people might call it pictographs, which is similar, but we found it on clay as well as animal skins and papyrus. So again, this is the oldest form of writing, is pictograms. Here you have a diagram of hieroglyphs. Again, a little bit more complex. The symbols um, are intricate to some degree. However, you might see where a lot of students notice that the V and the W have the same symbol. Um, and so I know in the German language, the V and the W will make the same sound when you when it's spoken. So um, it's kind of an interesting concept to do. And I've if we were in uh, regular non-COVID school, we would actually have an activity where you would actually write your name in hieroglyphs. A little side activity that I like to do, but unfortunately, in this case, we can't. So, apologize for that. Here is the example I was telling you about of cuneiform. Um, the clay tablet was obviously soft. You think about Play-Doh and how you would take a stylus, which would have a wedge-shaped style on one end and a circular, like an eraser style end on the other, and that was what's going to indicate these circles. As you can see here, you got four circles down here in the bottom left, and then you would have here's a really good example of a wedged shaped in this case. So again, this is cuneiform. And last and not least, our chart of the Phoenician alphabet. The Phoenicians would use this as a way to keep track of records of who sold what they like to buy, and you can actually see. To me, what's kind of interesting is how it, like for instance, the first letter here gets brought over to the Greek column, and then your Roman column. So it's again, you can actually start to see the development of our alphabet with the Roman, which was what we would call Latin. So that ends this week's PowerPoint. So what are we going to be doing next time? So next week we'll take a look at the development of religion and how it becomes an important part of the River Valley civilizations, as well as just a major part of society in general. We will see the difference between polytheism and monotheism, and we will take a look at the first major religion, Judaism. So that is all for me. Please stay safe and keep turning in those assignments. And as you can see, Mike's being dropped, and have a good evening.